Today I want to spend a minute and tell you about a play I just finished reading by Henrik Ibsen. Now he is, by many intellectuals and scholars, considered one of the greats. Like in the playwriting world, he stands pretty close to Shakespeare. Now, no one is ever going to stand above Shakespeare in the minds of most scholars. And I think one of the reasons for that is not just the sheer weight of everything that he wrote. He wrote so many plays, and so many good plays and known plays, and the role that he's played in the culture, but also the fact that it's poetic, and almost no other plays are written in poetic form, and so it makes it really, it makes his plays really different and deeper in that sense. But Ibsen's ideas and his influence, and the influence of Shakespeare on him, is talked about by most scholars that, if they ever do talk about playwrights and the history of plays. Ibsen stands out as one of the greatest and one of the founders of modern theater. There are a lot of aspects to modern theater, not all of which I'll talk about today, but one aspect of it was to change morality. Now, Oscar Wilde, in his rejection of manners, his hilarious way of mocking traditional manners, was also part of that movement in a sense, part of a little bit of a different movement. This was Ibsen's part of the Romantic movement that was reaction to the Age of Reason. And this getting back to what are my feelings telling me, and paying closer attention to what's going on inside me more than to what's going on around me. And Ibsen plays a huge role in that inner thinking world. This goes back to Hamlet and what some talk about is the self-overhearing, that kind of idea. Ibsen has some of that idea in his plays as well. So some recommend A Doll's House as his greatest. Others recommend Hedda Gabler. I'm going to talk to you about A Doll's House today, and maybe we'll do Hedda Gabler here soon. But this one is a story set in the 19th century. When it was written, it's usually performed with in that same time period as when it was written. This was written at the very end. I think it was 1890, if I remember correctly, that this one was written and performed first. And it has this capacity to really make you look inward, like I was saying a minute ago, to consider the self. And what he's doing here is kind of an extension of many ideas that Shakespeare laid down, and he's taking those ideas to their absolute extreme. So if Shakespeare was a lot about democracy and the equality of mankind and the equality of men and women and the importance of the individual, then Ibsen takes that, especially in A Doll's House, to its absolute extreme of the individual over everything else. So the setting is, it's in a house, and it's basically in the same room the whole time, and Nora is the character that we see have the major character development happen. She's the one that changes, and that comes to some truth. And of course, that's very characteristic of all great literature. So she has a profound change within herself, and the Nora that's talking to us at the end of the play is almost like, it was hard for me almost to believe that it really could happen this way, that she could really be the same person. Because it's all within, the whole play happens within just a few days. And so she is a housewife, she has 3 children, and they've been kind of moderately successful, kind of lower middle class kind of situation. And they went through a really hard time a few years previous when her husband became very, very ill, and he needed to go to another country. I think it was Italy that they needed to go to in order to restore his health. Well, this was going to cost $250, whatever the type of money was, I can't remember. And that was a ton of money. and they didn't have access to it. And Nora, you're set up in the play by having Nora and Torvald. Torvald. She calls him Torvald. He's Helmer. That's his last name is Helmer. And so she calls him Torvald all through the play. They have this conversation right at the beginning where it's this setup like she's the irresponsible spending wife who spends all the money that he makes, and he's the frugal, conservative, moral man who kind of holds her back and keeps her in check. And she's always taking the money and spending it like crazy, and he reminds her and the audience how important it is to stay out of debt, and how important it is that and it's Christmas time, and he doesn't want her to spend very much money, but she's saying, oh, it's just fine if I spend a lot of money because it's Christmas time and you just got this new job, you're going to manage the bank, all our financial problems are going to be solved, we're going to have tons of money, everything's going to be wonderful now. And so he's like, yes, but we don't have that money yet, and we shouldn't go into debt before, we shouldn't borrow money before we've earned it, so just hold off and just try to be conservative over Christmas. And so she says, you know what you could get me for Christmas? And he says, what? And she says, some money. And he's like, well, would you even spend it on yourself? And she's like, well, I don't know, I might spend it here or there. So we understand where they stand. In the meantime, a friend from college shows up. She's had a hard life. They have a conversation, and this friend, Christine, proceeds to tell Nora all about all these sacrifices that she's made over the last 10 years, taking care of her mother and her siblings, and what it has cost her in personal sacrifice and debt and all those other things. And so she really respects herself for this. She's not a very happy person, and she hasn't experienced a lot of joy, but she has a lot of self-respect because she's done all these things for her family. And now they're all gone and dead, and she's coming here and she's looking for work, and Nora's like, oh, my husband's a bank manager and he can probably find you a position. But in the meantime, she's kind of talking to Nora in a really condescending way, and everybody that interacts with Nora at the first part of the play is pretty they're polite, they love her. She's beautiful, she's kind of the life of the party kind of a girl, but it's obvious that everybody kind of considers her an airhead and kind of self-centered and kind of, she just spends and plays. She's just kind of and that's why it's called a doll's house, because she's the doll. And her father treated her like a doll, and her husband treats her like a doll, and most other people treat her like a doll too. She's a plaything. And when she does interact with her children, the only time she interacts with them, she's a really cute mom, and they play. But you realize later, that's how she is, that's who she is. She plays. So she proceeds to tell her friend that her life hasn't been easy either, and that she has actually done something that was very, very difficult for her, and she made a huge sacrifice for her husband to save his life. Because when this thing happened that they needed to leave the country, she knew exactly how her husband felt about debt, and that he would not go into debt even to save his own life, and that really scared her. So she proceeded to try to find a way to secure the money. Well, right about this time, her father happened to die. So she told her husband that she got the money in his will. Turns out her dad didn't leave her anything. I'm not sure if he even had anything to leave, and she had secured the money herself through a bond, and had pretended to have her father sign for it, but you find out later that she signed it herself in her father's name 3 days after he died. And the man she owes the money to figures that out because he finds out the death date, and then he knows that her signature is later than the death date. So that's Krogstad, and he shows up, and he's kind of the evil guy who she owes the money to, and her husband considers him immoral, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with him, and he dismisses him from the bank, and he comes to Nora and says, you've got to stop him from firing me, or I'm going to let him know everything that's gone on. She says, no, you can't let him know, I'll work it out, and she doesn't manage to work it out, and so he is fired, and so now it's this critical life moment for Nora. And her husband is about to find out that she's gone into all this deep debt and that she's broken the law. Now, it's a double breaking the law. It's not just that she had her father sign after his death. That would have been bad. But the thing that's even worse, that the other reason why this is illegal and wrong is because at that time, women had to have their husband's permission, or their spouses, whoever was responsible for them, had to have their permission to borrow money. So she didn't have any permission from any of her guardians. And what Ibsen is doing is he's trying to bring forward a situation in which a woman could be doing something very highly moral for all the right reasons, with absolute pure intent, making a great sacrifice, and it would bring to bear these kinds of laws that keep her trapped, that keep her home, that keep her from reaching her potential and doing things in the world that she could be doing, and keep her a doll, keep her someone else's property, keep her from really being what she could be and being her own woman. It's interesting because there were a lot of people that say that Ibsen was a feminist, and he said, if I never planned on it, that was never part of the agenda. I was never trying to be a feminist. I was never about women's rights. That was never part of the plan. And so I don't know exactly what... He wasn't trying to be a feminist, and he wasn't necessarily, I guess, pro-women's rights, but he was creating a moral dilemma for the audience where the empathy would be with the person who had had the right intent rather than the right action, which is fine, which there's nothing wrong with that. That can be a very, very valuable experience for everybody that watches it. So now Nora thinks something wonderful is going to happen, and it's going to be so wonderful that her husband is going to, that she's ready to commit suicide to make sure that it doesn't happen, because she trusts that she knows her husband and that he's a certain kind of man, and that when this problem comes to light, which it's about to, that he will sacrifice himself for her. She is positive that he is going to do that, and she's not going to allow him to do that, so she's going to have to commit suicide. So this happens. The miracle doesn't happen. He doesn't sacrifice himself for her. In fact, he comes forward and he worries and thinks only about himself. And what you come to see is that actually the woman is the moral superior. That she is the one that actually had his interests in mind, and when they're in another crisis where she's in trouble, he doesn't have her interests in mind. So there's all kinds of wonderful things to think about and consider in this play. I can see how it would produce a lot of fantastic discussion. There's nothing in it that you wouldn't necessarily want your children to read. There's nothing, inappropriate or anything along those lines. But there's a really big moral dilemma here, and it really needs to be talked through, because while there are several things that Ibsen is saying that are very valuable, that could build character, that are very moral, there's also kind of this idea that can be dangerous if not really well understood. And I would suspect, I've got to do more Ibsen study, but I would suspect that this was part of what Ibsen was saying, because what it is, in what he's doing is he's exalting the individual above everything, even above family and primary obligations and responsibilities. What he says through Nora at the end of the play, aside from all these other valuable things about thinking about others and about intention versus behavior and about seeing the individual, he has Nora come forward and say, look, I've just figured it all out. I get you, I get me, I get what we're doing here. We've never had a serious conversation in 8 years. We don't know each other at all. I'm living with a stranger and I've borne him 3 children, and I don't even know what in the world it is that I'm doing here. So she makes the decision that she's going to leave. She's going to abandon them, and she's going to completely cut off contact permanently with her husband and children. They have a nurse there who helped to bring up Nora, and by this point Nora is convinced that this nurse can raise her children better than she can. And what she's come to is this soul sickness, where she recognizes that she has been a pawn and a toy in the hands of other people all her life, that she hasn't had original ideas and thoughts, that she doesn't really have any idea who she really is, what she really likes, and what she's really about, because she never took the time to get to know herself and discover herself and to do... She took this action for her husband, which brought her a lot of self-respect, and she realized that she was capable of great sacrifice because she did things, she sacrificed things that she wanted, and she did work on the side without her husband knowing in order to try to pay back this loan. So she had done something very moral and respectable. But when it came right down to it and she realized, I don't know who I am and I don't know what I'm about, they have this conversation and she says, I'm going to leave. I've just got to leave. And he's like, Torvald says, To desert your home, your husband and your children, and you don't consider what people will say? Nora, I cannot consider that at all. I only know it is necessary for me. Helmer Torvald, it's shocking. This is how you would neglect your most sacred duties? She says, what do you consider my most sacred duties? And he says, do I need to tell you that? Are they not your duties to your husband and your children? And Nora says, I have other duties just as sacred. That you have not. What duties could those be? And she says, duties to myself. And then she proceeds to give this explanation about how she doesn't know herself and she's never had original ideas and she's got to go out and get her own education and figure out who she is and become a whole human being before she can give anything to her husband and children. Now, I personally totally get what it is that she's saying, and I understand the dichotomy that Ibsen is presenting. But he's presenting it in an all or nothing fashion. The husband cannot come up, because he's so selfish and absorbed with his own interests, all he can do is societal duty and obligation to her. And though he does love her, and she makes a statement, and I think she's right on. She says, you don't love me, you're in love with being in love with me. You just think it's wonderful to be in love with me. And there's a lot of validity to that. And he is a stranger to her in a lot of ways, and she's a stranger to herself. But is it then okay to leave, to desert permanently, and have no contact? That's the big question. And the answer to that question has implications to today. This was 125 years ago. This play originated, and he has had a powerful impact in the theatrical world in the way that especially the intellectuals that lead out and our professors and our teachers in our school systems read this, and they're influenced greatly by it, and they perpetuate the ideas that Ibsen's putting forth. And he's putting it in such a way that he wants you to acknowledge that the self comes first before any other duty, and that you must be a whole person before you can do anything for anyone else, and that what she's got to do is put all her needs and all her wants first before she even tries to be anything to her family. And he won't give merit to the idea that maybe she can do both. That maybe she can stay and get to know her husband and try and work things through. She doesn't respect him now, and maybe they would try, and maybe even divorce would have to be part of the solution, I don't know. But then especially to then abandon her children, maybe she can be the example for her husband and her children. At one point he's like, you can't have any contact with the kids because you're so immoral, and yet in many ways she's the moral superior. So it is, I wasn't sure where it was going, and until that last scene I wasn't sure if there was going to be a lot there, and I kept asking myself, how is this thing so profound? How is there so much to it? And I'm beginning to see why there's so much to it and why it's important and it has a lot of influence. So that is Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, a very influential play by a very influential playwright, which I recommend that you read and think about and discuss in a mature manner with students who are ready to have these kinds of conversations. We'll see you next time.